Welcome. I'm Jean Bailey. I am the Associate Professor and Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs in the School of Medicine at Virginia Commonwealth University. And today I'm joined by Nicole Deiorio. She's Professor of Emergency Medicine and Associate Dean of Student Affairs in the Undergraduate Medical Education office in the School of Medicine. And we're going to talk about letters of recommendation in medical education. So Nicole, why are we talking about this now? What's different about this year?
This year, there are a lot of reasons for people to re-examine their normal patterns of behavior in writing letters. First of all, there's a long overdue attention towards avoiding bias in letters of recommendation in terms of gender, race, ethnicity. So we'll go over some specific strategies for that a little bit later in the podcast. Additionally, because of the changes that COVID has wrought in the medical education system, particularly in undergraduate medical education, medical students aren't having the traditional rotation experiences that help to augment their residency applications. In the past, students may have done several away rotations and relied on getting a letter from each of those. But now, since travel is limited, students may be asking letter writers who aren't traditional letter writers for those required letters of recommendation. And so we wanted to provide this podcast to give some tips for folks who may be new to writing letters, particularly for medical students. Additionally, even before COVID, there's been more attention towards competency-based medical education. Because of that, some letters or specialty expectations may not just include all glowing performance about the student. There's more attention that students are at different stages of development in different areas and categories. And so a letter may actually say ways in which a student could improve or describe their performance in things other than glowing terms. And so we need to think about adjusting our letters to incorporate that framework. Some specialties are actually moving towards specialized letters of recommendation or evaluation with particular structured formats, but we're not covering those today. We're talking more about a free-form unstructured letter that a learner might ask you to write.
So a lot of good information there, and I can see the need to address this. When I think of a letter of recommendation, I think of structure and how a letter is typically laid out with a beginning or an introduction, and then that middle part where there's the meat about the topic, and then that closing or summary. Can we break this down paragraph by paragraph, perhaps, and give me some information on each one of these? So what should the opening paragraph contain, for example?
The nice thing about a typical letter of recommendation is you don't have to think about it in any different structure than you would for most letters or statements. So you're absolutely right that you should think of it in terms of opening, middle, and closing. In the opening paragraph, it's nice to start with the context in which you know the learner. So have you known them over many years in a mentorship role? Did you work with them for 2 weeks or 1 month on a single rotation? Did you work with them on a research project? Was it a combination of all of those? Each of those experiences would give a different lens of assessing a student, so it's helpful for the reader of the letter to be able to put that into context. You'll want to cover with why you're writing the letter. Presumably the student or resident asked you to write a letter as part of their residency application, but it's helpful to acknowledge that overtly. You may find yourself writing a letter for a student who's applying into a specialty or a situation that you don't personally practice in or that you're not familiar with. And that may give you some pause, but it really shouldn't have to. For example, you might be an internal medicine physician who is going to write a letter about a student applying into surgery. You may worry that you don't know what a good letter for surgery might look like, but that is absolutely not the case. You've probably had experience with surgical residents as consultants, with surgery attendings as colleagues, and you should definitely frame your letter that way. You are certainly well equipped to comment on what would make a good surgical colleague and then speak to how that student would fit that mold. You may be assistant program director in your own residency. And so while you may not have that particular experience with a surgical residency, you should certainly acknowledge that you've got experience in assessing residents, assessing students for residency, and that'll really add some credibility to what you're saying about the student. Lastly, the first paragraph should contain information about if the student waived their right to see their letter. We in Student Affairs encourage all students to waive their right to see their letter. So that's going to be the expectation. And you should clarify and confirm that that was the case with this particular letter as well.
Thanks. So what about that middle paragraph and the meat of the letter? What do you suggest putting in that?
So in general, this is where you're going to list all of your supporting evidence and thoughts about why this student would be a good match for the residency that they're applying into. You can use whatever framework you're comfortable with. Maybe you only knew the student in a very limited capacity, and so may only want to comment on 2 or 3 particular skills that they performed really well. If you have some educational leadership experience, you may want to try to comment on each of the competency areas. It really doesn't matter how you structure this middle part. I would say some good tips are to try to be as specific as possible, using particular examples to demonstrate why you feel the student is strong in medical knowledge, for example, or professionalism. Those examples are really going to stick in letter readers' minds in a way that leaves a more favorable impression than more generic or vague language. Other things to think about in this section are ways to avoid bias, like we mentioned before. And so I want to refer you all to one particularly good resource that I like around avoiding gender bias, although you can apply the lessons to any other type of bias that people are prone to. So it's the University of Arizona Commission on the Status of Women's document. This is a one-page PDF that's easy to read and absorb. And it talks about potential areas of bias. For example, letters for men are generally 16% longer than letters for women. So be sure that your letter lengths tend to be equal. And there's a lot of helpful tips around wording that can be potentially stereotyping. One example that they mention are, even though positive traits like being caring or compassionate are helpful, might feel like you're really doing the applicant a service, these can evoke particular gender stereotypes, which could inadvertently hurt a candidate. There's a nice list of vocabulary words to avoid and adjectives to substitute instead. So I suggest you all take a look. Once you're done with your letter, give it a last read, imagining if you would say these things about any other type of student and see if there's ways you can tweak it at the end to avoid these potentially biasing and stereotyping words or habits. The last thing I want to say about the middle section of the letter is that you would ideally like it to portray a unifying story about the applicant. You don't need, and in fact, you should not simply rehash their CV, because program directors will be able to read that in parallel. But if the CV tells a story or promotes sort of a brand about the applicant, that's a nice thing that you can also highlight in your letter. So if there's themes, for example, of serving certain communities, and then you notice those interests and passions show up in your experience with that learner, that it would be a really nice thing to tie together, so that the applicant's entire package tells a certain story.
So that final paragraph where you're going to bring things to a close, what might you suggest that people include in that paragraph?
It's nice to have a couple of summary sentences about the applicant. No one expects there to be any code words in their general letter writers, so you don't have to worry that if you're saying this is a strong candidate versus a very strong candidate, that is going to convey anything. Just speak honestly and authentically about the applicant. It's helpful to put a bit of a personal spin in the final section if you feel that that's appropriate, like saying something along the lines of, you wish this applicant was applying to your own program. They would be a strong candidate if they were to apply in internal medicine as opposed to surgery as well. A statement like that can help leave the reader with a positive impression of the applicant. So one tendency that letter writers have traditionally had is to end with, please let me know if you have any more questions about this applicant. And I would caution you about including that statement with increasing attention paid to FERPA, the Educational Privacy Act. It may actually not be legal for programs and letter writers to have sort of informal contact in this follow-up way without particular permission of the applicant. So just be careful that you're not straying into gray territory there. If you are approached to offer additional information, just be sure that you're clearing that with the student first, and ideally documenting this in some kind of permanent way, just in case any questions ever arise. That's the safest practice.
Oh, great. That really gives us a clear understanding of the different components of the letter, so that it's helpful to see how you paint that picture of the applicant to the letter reader. So conventional wisdom says that you should only say yes to the request of writing a letter if you're able to write a strong letter. Is that still the case? Do you have to be sure that your letter will be strong before you commit to writing one?
Well, that's become a much more nuanced question in the past few years, and certainly in this past year with the challenges that COVID has brought, as I alluded to before. Some students might be in the position of needing 4 letters of recommendation for their application to be complete, but they may not have 4 different experiences where they're really shining at a top level. So they may be approaching you because they really just need that 3rd or 4th letter no matter what. And so if you are feeling like this maybe wasn't the strongest student that you worked with, I would have that conversation up front with the student and candidly let them know that your letter might contain not only superlatives, but ways where the student's skills are still emerging. And they may actually be okay with that and want you to go ahead with the letter anyway. So don't just say no right off the bat without exploring a little more deeply. And you can always reach out to the clerkship director or the program director of your own program for advice, or any of us in student affairs, me or Dr. Willabin, are happy to help you out with navigating that situation. The other situation is if the student is applying into a specialty where the expectation is that these are more letters of evaluation as opposed to letters of recommendation. There may be more of a cultural expectation that you're needed to touch on both their strengths and the areas which they may need more attention. And so if you suspect that might be the case, you can always reach out to the clerkship director or the program director of the specialty that the student is applying in for any advice.
What if a student asks for a letter and you just know that the letter wouldn't be strong? Is there an option to say no to a request?
You should never feel forced to write a letter, of course. We want these to be things that you write because you want to support the student as best that you can and come from a place of genuinely wanting to help the student. It is fine to say no. We just encourage you to be slightly more open to the idea this year as opposed to other years.
So if someone's asked for a letter, what's my timeline to write this? When are they really due?
Well, I hesitate to give this answer on the record because sometimes I will advise students to give their letter writers a artificial deadline in advance of the real deadline, so they're not stressing up until the last minute about whether the writer is going to deliver. But because I support full transparency, the timeline for the residency match has changed this year such that deadlines are later than they were in years prior. So you can always upload a letter anytime until rank lists are due. So if a student is asking you for a letter based on a rotation that they're doing in October or November, it's never too late to put a letter in. In general, though, we want the student's application to be entirely complete by October 21st, 2020. Letters can be uploaded anytime before October 21st, but that's the date when programs have access to all the student applications. And so we really want the application to be complete at that moment.
We're also busy. Is it okay to ask a student to draft the letter first and then have them send it back to me and for editing and then my signature to send it on at that point?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like ethically that's completely fine to do. If that's a way to just get the letter started, and again, to be sure that you're augmenting the story that the student wants to tell about themselves and understand the direction that a student is hoping a letter will take, that's completely fine. I will say that while this is more common practice for us as faculty and attendings, a student will probably never have encountered this request before, and it can feel a little off-putting to them. So just couch that offer to them, knowing that this may be the first time they've experienced that workflow of letter writing.
So any concluding remarks for us? Any final thoughts that you can share about this process?
Yeah, in closing, I would say writing letters of recommendation are a huge service to students and a great way to support their path in medical education. We know that this year particularly is bringing many challenges, and while you may not have been a part of the traditional pool of letter writers in the past, we're really encouraging you to be open to the idea this year. And again, it's a way to support students and the medical education system. So if you have that guiding principle in mind, I'm sure your letters are going to shine through. As long as you're thinking about these particular tips and tricks and potential missteps, I know you're going to have great letters and be able to support students in their next phase of their career. We in Student Affairs are always available to help you out with any questions or ethical dilemmas. So please feel free to contact us and use our advice liberally. Email me anytime with questions. It's nicole.deiorio@bcuhealth.org. And Chris Woolabin is also always happy to help out. Also, he's Christopher.Woolabin.
Thanks, Nicole. This was great information. I really appreciate your spending time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.